Good morning, everyone, here and online. As was stated, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. And yes, we've been a long-term partner with Unidair on these conferences. I was looking back in my files to see how long we have been involved. And as far as I can tell, since 2010, we've been really delighted to have this opportunity. We thank Unidair for allowing us to be part of this great conversation. Today, we'll be talking about the security of cislunar space and beyond. And this is something I'm just absolutely delighted to have involved in this conversation. I think it's been historically missing from multilateral space security discussions. So this is great to be here and have this fantastic panel to discuss this. And I think it's really relevant because we have the changing nature of activities and actors on the moon are causing the possibility for instability and conflict. In a time of instability, we're seeing an increase in the number of states on the moon. We're seeing a vast increase in the number of countries that have plans to go to the moon. We're seeing an increase in the types of activities and the actors. We're seeing commercial actors on the moon for the first time. And to date, prior to that, part of the past couple of years, all the actors and activities on the moon were civil in nature. And so there's a tension between how do you work out who, if there's a commercial activity and a civil or scientific activity, how do you rate the two? How do you decide who gets priority for what? As well, we're seeing the possibility of two governance regimes arising in regards to how principles and activities are carried out for the moon and other celestial bodies in terms of exploration. It's still to be determined, if they will be complementary or competitive. They don't have to be, they can be, complementary, but the concern, of course, is that geopolitical rivalry in Earth will replicate itself in the moon and beyond. And that can backfill to instability on Earth. So it's definitely, I think, relevant to the discussion here at the United Nations. And as well, we're already starting to see cislunar traffic coordination issues, and even some cislunar debris. As I stated before, as we heard yesterday from the head of UNUSA, there's a ample number of opportunities at the civil space level from multilateral discussions on lunar and cislunar discussions. You have the COPUS working group, which is looking at legal aspects of space resource use. You have the ATLAC for consultation and activities, but there's nothing equivalent here. And allow me for a minute just to do a quick advertisement. Jessica West and I just published last night an analysis on CG of the recent open-ended working group and the discussions that happened then. And one of the things we identified was that cislunar discussions have not been part of the space security conversations to date. And again, that's a concern because you might have a inadvertent escalation, especially if you have geopolitical nuclear armed rivals that are doing these activities on the moon. So with that, we're going to have today's panel. We'll look at how the current legal and policy framework can address the challenges that I mentioned, consider what lessons can be drawn from the existing practices, and explore how ongoing space security discussions can help understand these specific challenges of the cislunar domain and beyond. So with that, I'm going to have my panelists speak for just a few minutes. We'll have some questions, so be prepared, be thinking of some questions you might want to ask from the audience. I'm going to start off with Antonino Salmeri, who's the director of the Lunar Policy Platform. Antonino?
Good morning, colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to start by thanking Unidair for inviting me today. It's wonderful to see cislunar discussion in the context of the Outer Space Security Conference, which is a wonderful event that we're delighted to be part of as LPP. So as Victoria said, over the past years, there has been an acceleration of lunar developments. There is more and more countries aiming to go to the moon. There is private companies already trying to land on the moon, and some have even succeeded. And there is growing plans for the development of infrastructure that will enable a long-term, large-scale operations on the lunar surface. Now, when we look at these developments from the legal and policy perspective, we've always been addressing so far issues of safety and sustainability. The question for me, whether security also is an aspect that we should be considering of when we think about lunar activities, has recently changed. So I'd like to start with the Outer Space Treaty, which is the foundations over which we all build. I'm not going to give a lecture, of course, on it, but it's important to remember that Article 4 2 of the Outer Space Treaty sets a special regime in terms of military activities on the moon. Because as you know, under Article 4, Part 1, the first paragraph, military activities in outer space are not strictly prohibited per se. In fact, there is some kind of very dangerous activity, such as the placement of mass destruction, that is explicitly prohibited, but the use of space for military purposes is not prohibited per se. And we've seen that in recent developments, but since the very beginning of space. When we look at the moon instead, Article 4.2 says that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. That has always been interpreted as prohibiting entirely any kind of military involvement in lunar activities, except for what is explicitly permitted under the treaty. And Article 4.2 gives some examples. For example, you can use military personnel to conduct lunar activities. In fact, the first astronauts landing on the moon, they were all members of the US military, even though they didn't go, of course, in a military capacity. But that said, there is no further involvement of military activities on the moon. Now, this would say, in a normal world, we would say that then there is no problem. We don't have any security issues related to the moon because it shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. The question is, will it be done or not? And can we really separate the security domain from the safety and sustainability aspect? I think as we see an increase of activities in the lunar surface and in the lunar orbit, it's going to be more and more complicated, especially, of course, in the current geopolitical context. If there is one thing that made me change my mind about whether we need to start worrying about security issues in the lunar domain, is certainly the deployment of nuclear reactors on the moon. That is something that was recently announced, as you probably have heard from the acting NASA administrator, Sean Duffy, about the necessity for the United States to deploy nuclear reactors to sustain lunar activities in the long term. Now, this is, in fact, something not so new. We always knew, in fact, that there was going to be some sort of nuclear reactor on the moon. This was already announced in the first Trump administration. China and Russia are already planning the deployment of their own nuclear reactors, and this is already in development for deployment in the 2030s. The problem is that in the current narrative that was recently framed, nuclear reactors can become an excuse to exercise undue territorial influence on the moon. And that's where I think the security aspect comes into play. Obviously, deploying a nuclear reactor is not an act that you do so easily. You need to think carefully, where do you want it? How are you going to manage it? And how the deployment of a nuclear reactor will impact the others in terms of operations, but also in terms of perception. It's, in fact, almost an act of sovereignty to deploy something that is so powerful and it's going to stay almost forever on the lunar surface. And it has implication. If you have a nuclear reactor around, can you have a lunar base in the proximity of a lunar reactor? Isn't it too dangerous for the infrastructure and for the people? So those are the kind of questions that I believe we should start addressing. And the good news is that we are still on time to do so. Nothing will be deployed before the 2030s, so we have roughly 3 years to start considering these topics. And we also have the frameworks to do so. So the United Nations has a working group on the use of nuclear power sources in space, which meets every year at the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. They have developed principles and a safety framework for the use of nuclear sources, but they haven't considered very deeply the question of deployment of reactors on the surface especially. But as of next year, this will change. I believe the work plan of the working group has the consideration of nuclear reactors into its future activities for 2026 and beyond. And in 2026, there will also be a joint conference between the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN and the MPS working group the day before COPUS to discuss exactly novel applications in space. And so we are going to have an opportunity to start discussing these issues. Then how this will be framed in Geneva, it's of course a conversation that I would love to have more also with the rest of the panel. One final thing from our side at LPP, we're also considering this topic for consultation processes next year. So what we do, how we contribute to this discussion is we conduct annual consultations in a bilateral fashion. So we invite all stakeholders to sit down with us for Chatham House conversations and understand what are their priorities, what are their issues in a candid manner. And then we compile reports that will give you an assessment of common ground and divergences between the two players, between a variety of players. And then we can use those reports to advance conversations in the proper fora. So we are now making our plans for 2026, and nuclear is certainly on the top of that. So we'd like to see also how this conversation goes, if there is any scope to start addressing this also from the policy aspect, from an NGO perspective. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonino. And I think the point that you made about how there's still time is a very good one. Oftentimes, I feel like governance is rushing to catch up with technology and activities, but here's an opportunity for us as an international policy group to think about, okay, what do we want? What sort of principles do we want to see enacted? And how do we go ahead accomplishing them before we're faced with facts on the ground? So with that, I'd like to hear from our next speaker, Yun Zhao, who's a professor at the University of Hong Kong.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, I think would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this forum. Before I came over, I think luckily I have produced an article. I think actually also deals with the lunar space. So for that article, I basically proposed a lunar-centric legal regime to preserve peaceful and sustainable use of the lunar space. So I think that is something I would like to summarize for today's presentation, very short presentation. So lunar space has become a focal point for leading spacefaring nations with a plan to develop infrastructure to support the lunar missions. If we look at the current or existing legal framework, which were designed primarily for Earth orbit and near Earth activities, we believe that this kind of legal framework is good, provides a foundational basis for our for us to address legal issues, but is not adequate. So that's why we should really look into a new regime to study, possible new regime for the lunar exploratory activities. The lunar missions during the Cold War were characterized by short-term exploration. This new era aims at establishing a long-term human presence on the moon with the goal of using it as a platform for deep space exploration. This provides a basis for us to consider what kind of a legal regime will be appropriate. We can also look into the policies and regimes that were made at the national level, especially when we look at the US and China. So these are the two, well, among the most significant players in this field. If we look at the American policy, we can find out that they emphasize the need to protect and defend the US interest. But if we look at the Chinese policy, well, we have to look at the white paper, which mentioned about several aspects. For example, it mentioned about the lunar space as a gateway for deep space exploration. China's space strategy views the lunar region as a critical stepping stone for further exploration, particularly for missions to the moon and Mars. It also acknowledged the dual-use nature of the space. So, at the current stage, when we talk about the peaceful use and sustainable use of the lunar space, first of all, we need to look at the provisions in Outer Space Treaty. I think we have just mentioned about the Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. Paragraph 1 of the Article 4 prohibits the use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction without direct reference to peaceful purposes. Paragraph 2 specifically references the exclusive peaceful uses of the moon and other celestial bodies. So in this regard, I think these two paragraphs, for the first paragraph, if we would like to apply to the lunar space, given that it is a relatively new domain of human activity, I believe that there's an opportunity for the member states to discuss for the possibility to establish a demilitarized regime before it becomes fully developed. So this, of course, will be difficult, but I think that will be a very good opportunity to consider. Regarding paragraph 2, a literal interpretation suggested that the listed activities are exhaustive, but if we look at other treaties, for example, if we look at the Antarctic Treaty, which uses more explicit language regarding demilitarization, which prohibit any measure of a military nature. So that could be something for us to consider regarding the peaceful uses of the lunar space. When it comes to the sustainable use of the lunar space, we again can make reference to the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which provides a foundational framework for avoiding harmful interference, the due regard principle, and the consultation mechanism, which I think we have heated discussions yesterday already. Again, I think Article 9 definitely will apply to this emerging domain. However, the framework requires further improvements. So that is something we could look into the so-called lunar-centric legal regime. We have the foundations already, the existing legal regime set up by the Outer Space Treaty and other existing space treaties, but we can also consider how to further develop. When we look at the development, we will need to look at the roles played by the major spacefaring nations, for example, China and the US, to avert potential conflicts between the space powers. Establishing a specialized legal regime for cislunar space governance is not merely desirable, it is essential. Now I will briefly mention about the legal framework, the so-called cislunar-centric legal regime, or what should be the focus. The primary element of the proposed regime should include, first, stricter regulations to ensure peaceful and sustainable use of cislunar space are required. A legal regime for cislunar space could build on the foundational principle of peaceful uses of outer space in OST, specifically focusing on preventing military expansion and strategic competition in the cislunar area. Second, the new developments in cislunar and lunar activities need to be recognized, prioritizing supporting lunar exploration objectives. While military concerns were paramount at the dawn of the space age, commercial interests have become increasingly significant in the current era. A regulatory regime that includes stricter rules for military use than those governing traditional space activity could support this shift, promoting a commercially viable and stable cislunar environment. Third, basically the existing space rules should be leveraged as foundation, but improving the existing rules as foundational steps towards a lunar-centric legal regime. So when we talk about the lunar-centric legal regime, we can think of like the exclusive peaceful purposes, the space sustainability issues. So these are the few points we have to seriously consider. Furthermore, we should also emphasize about the importance of international cooperation and also the coordination, in particular, when we talk about the China-US coordination as a key step towards lunar-centric legal regime. Core principles in the UNMISS Accords, such as policy transparency, interoperable systems, emergency assistance, safe debris disposal, etc. I'm sure I think these policies can also be accepted at the international level, but of course we can see how to put that in the detailed rules or policies. So building on these shared principles, the US and China and other spacefaring nations could collaborate to develop specific rules aimed at preventing conflicts and misunderstandings, a step essential not only for peaceful and sustainable developments or lunar activities, but also for the effective implementation of each country's space programs. So to summarize, the cislunar space represents an uncharted frontier within the broader domain of outer space, which is currently governed by existing international treaties and soft laws. Cislunar space requires an innovative legal approach. Given the most cislunar activities are intended to support lunar programs, a lunar-centric legal regime is put forward as a long-term solution. This regime would focus on the exploration and use of the moon, helping stakeholders to identify shared interests and facilitating consensus on governance in this new frontier. A fully realized legal regime may be challenging to achieve in the near future. So the initial measure that builds on existing treaties and soft laws is advisable. When we look ahead, a comprehensive lunar-centric legal regime that overcomes the limitations of a traditional space governance is efficient. A future legal regime should be both independent and comprehensive. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhao. Yeah, I definitely, the idea that there are definitely principles that are relevant that we can just apply to this different domain, I think is really important to understand that that is how these domains evolve. And that's why I think discussions and fora like here are really important, because what we need to do is see, okay, well, how do different actors view these domains and how do they view these principles and what are their priorities? And that way we can actually build to this new, whether it's a legal regime or just a common understanding of best practices. But you can't get to that point until you have these conversations. So again, that's why I'm really excited about today's panel. I'm looking forward to hearing how many countries and observers view, these activities on the moon and what priorities are for that. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Martina Elia Vituloni, who's a doctoral candidate and researcher at the McGill Institute for Air and Space Law. Martina?
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation, and I wanted to focus my remarks today on the importance of a clear and consistent interpretation of the Aerospace Treaty to ensure the security of the cislunar space. We usually hear the main criticism of the Aerospace Treaty that is very abstract and a set of rules that are too general. And this is a fair criticism because the treaty was designed to be that way. The name itself says Treaty on Principles. And when we read the preparatory works, we can see that their intention was to create a set of principles that serves as a foundation for later treaties that were going to be drafted as new challenges were presented in the international space law community. This functioned well for a decade, but then we stopped having these treaties, and now we are in this situation where we are in a gray area, and we don't know what the rules are. So if we operate under the assumption that we will not have a new treaty in the foreseeable future, we need to, and I take this word from yesterday, operationalize the provisions that we have in the treaty to ensure a degree of certain legal certainty for all space stakeholders involved. So this requires to conduct an interpretation of the Aerospace Treaty in light of current events and circumstances. But once we start interpreting the Aerospace Treaty, we run into different problems. And there are certain tools in international law that can help us to solve these issues. I wanted to focus particularly in two problems that I have noticed. In the first place, it will depend on which version of the treaty are we reading. To just give you an example, when we read the Spanish and French version of Article 9, they refer to obstacles instead of interference. And if we continue reading Article 9 in the Spanish version, it completely eliminates the obligation to avoid harmful contamination of outer space, and it refers to avoid the harmful contamination of Earth's environment. So now let's imagine the situation where I have a Spanish-speaking operator that works under Spanish written laws, where they think that they are not breaching any rules, even if they are causing the harmful contamination of outer space, because in their version of the treaty, this is not an obligation. In front, we have someone that comes from an English-speaking background who thinks that this is actually a breach of international law and can put in place countermeasures to induce compliance. So this can lead to an escalated in tensions between these two space stakeholders. So this highlights the importance of understanding that even the Aerospace Treaty in itself, in its different 5 authentic versions and in the official translation in Arabic, has these discrepancies that can lead to different space actors understanding their obligations in a different manner. So this is the first thing that we need to ensure, that everyone that is involved in lunar activities is understanding the Aerospace Treaty in the same manner. And at the McGill Institute, we are developing this project to conduct a multilingual interpretation of the Aerospace Treaty in order to identify these discrepancies and to provide a foundational base that will ensure maybe an harmonized and consistent interpretation and application to ensure that all the space actors involved, including those from the Global South, whose participation was remarked by the director of UNOSA yesterday, have the same understanding of what their obligations and what is that the Aerospace Treaty demands from them in order to ensure that there's consistency and there's a certain level of communication and understanding between the different actors involved. With what concerns the second point that I identified, when we are operationalizing these provisions of the Aerospace Treaty, we need to keep in mind certain tools that we have in international law that can help us to further understand what are our obligations and what are our rights under the Aerospace Treaty. So I have recently come across some scholarship saying that due regard creates a first mover's advantage, which I completely disagree in my personal opinion. But if we want to argue this in a scholarly manner, the obligation to act with due regard requires a state to balance their interests, and it's clearly a best effort obligation. And recently, the International Court of Justice issued a very scholarly advisory opinion on climate change, where they were really unpacking these concepts, such as obligations of conduct, as well as due diligence. And when they were referring to obligations of conduct, among some of the factors that they were mentioning that we should consider, they explicitly included intergenerational equality. So this opens the doors for us to consider as well how the Outer Space Treaty, through due regard, allow us to consider as well the impact that activities that are being planned for the moon also need to consider the impact that they will have in the future and how it will impact the rights of states that are currently not now in space, but they have certainly the interest of going to the moon in the future. So this completely erases this idea that there's a first mover's advantage, because me as a state or as a private actor, I have to consider what will be the impact. And in doing this consideration, I need to take into account the magnitude of the impact that it will have in the interest of other actors in the space sector, including the future generation. So this also gives like this certain limitation to the scope of actions that we can take. And also related to this, and to the discussion that we had yesterday pertaining the relevance and how we can apply non-binding instruments to understand and maybe complement the existing regime. In this advisor opinion, which I highly recommend to go to read, even if you don't do climate change law, ICJ also explained that in order to further assess whether a state is in compliance with obligations of conduct, we need to have recourse to the standard of due diligence. Now, they unpack different factors for due diligence, one of them being international instruments and standards. And when they go to explain what international instruments and standards mean, they refer to norms of behavior, codes of conduct, as well as other soft law instrument or non-binding instruments. So in this sense, for example, if we want to consider the exploitation of space resources, for example, we could take into account the principles that are being drafted by the working group at the UN COPIUS. And then the breach will not be of the non-binding instrument in itself, but of the primary obligation that's being breached, let's say due regard, for example. So in this sense, these non-binding instruments will serve as evidence of the breach of a treaty obligation. And this is another way in which we can further advance the discussion to ensure that there's a safe, sustainable, and secure cislunar space through these soft law instruments, because ultimately all states are binding by the duty to prevent harm to other states, to act with due diligence, and through different obligations in the Outer Space Treaty. So when we start incorporating these rules, we see that international law gives us like a much more ample room to wiggle and to maybe determine how the law should apply on a certain situation in cislunar space. And we need to stop operating in these silos where we are so used to the fragmentation of international law that we just refer to space law, environmental law as environmental law, and we don't see that they are interconnected and that all these principles should apply together. So for example, when we're talking about the security of the moon, we are only mentioning Article 4, but in reality, we also have principles of the law of armed conflict, we have the non-intervention principles, UN Charter principles. So to sum up, my whole takeaway in this is we need to be aware in the first place of how others might interpret the Outer Space Treaty, not because this is a capricious manner of interpreting, but because the treaty in itself has difference in different languages. And in the second place, we need to also consider how we are not just limited by the Outer Space Treaty or by special space law instruments, but we need to look to international law, which is also applicable to outer space and can give us certain answers to questions that we're posing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. I really like the idea of talking about intergenerational equality when looking at governance mechanisms and models for the moon. I think that repositions the conversation far away from whether in the US, the parlance is a space race. And so I think that really gives it a longer term consequence that takes out some of the geopolitical issues. So I think it's a really interesting framing as well. Allow me to do another advertisement. Your point about due regard and the different linguistic interpretations of that is covered in the space security lexicon that Unidair and Secure World put out a few years ago. And we did note that difference in interpretation there. So that might be something of interest for other follow-up discussions on this. So with that, I'd like to have our last speaker, Luisa Handel Mazzetti, who's an assistant professor at the Netherlands Defense Academy. Luisa?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to our host for the kind invitation and for the truly stimulating discussions that I've heard yesterday. I was able to write a lot of interesting thoughts down. So my research, which I do at the Leiden Institute of Air and Space Law, focuses on the use of outer space and on the wider debate surrounding weaponization. And against that backdrop, I kind of wanted to continue discussing the moon and the cislunar security focused on hard security. What makes the moon so fascinating to me is that unlike much of outer space, which we discussed yesterday, is subject to relatively clear legal obligations when it concerns hard security. Article 4, as has already been said, explicitly prohibits its militarization. And this stands in contrast to the much more ambiguous provisions governing the larger orbital region. To me, this clarity kind of offers something quite rare in space law: hope. Hope that the moon might remain a place reserved for peaceful purposes, and hope that we might resist repeating the cycles of rivalry that have shaped the history of our orbital regime. And to me, this hope is not necessarily naive yet. As has been said, we still have the time. And shared by many, the moon appears to hold limited direct military utility. Yet hope alone is, of course, not enough. The moon and the broader cislunar region is not untouched by politics. They represent both a continuation of longstanding challenges that we've already discussed yesterday about orbital regimes, but also the emergence of entirely new dilemmas. On the side of continuity, we see familiar ambiguities. What does peaceful purposes exactly mean, and what implications does it have for the cislunar legal regime? How should we define uses of force or other harmful activities on the moon? Even Article 4, as has already been stated, despite its apparent clarity, leaves significant questions about what types of military activities are truly prohibited. These definitional uncertainties, which are also very prevalent in discussions on battles discussed yesterday, have not disappeared. They have simply followed us to the cislunar frontier. The prohibition of appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty raises further concerns. On paper, it's quite absolute. Yet in practice, mechanisms such as safety zones that we've seen emerge in certain governments' provisions risk being seen as de facto claims of territorial control, which has also been pointed out on this panel already. I'm referring, for example, to the possibility of states creating safety zones around, for example, nuclear energy sources, or to protect landing sites. Here, we encounter a potential loophole in the very center of space law. Add to this the reality of renewed geopolitical rivalry, and it's difficult to avoid the impression that the moon may be the stage for a second space race. At the same time, the cislunar domain introduces challenges that are genuinely new. From a strategic perspective, placing weapons on the moon to strike Earth makes little sense. But this does not mean that the moon is irrelevant to questions of force. Lunar or cislunar assets could still be used to interfere with satellites. Certain locations, such as the Lagrange points, have enormous value, potentially as launch pads for attacks, but primarily as privileged vantage points for surveillance and monitoring. Then there's the challenge of space situational awareness in the lunar regime. If tracking or specifying intent, which we've discussed yesterday, is already difficult in low Earth orbit, it's even more difficult in cislunar space, if not almost impossible. This blind spot is more than a technical problem. It is a security dilemma. Without transparency, intentions are easily misread, and miscalculation becomes far more likely. And finally, there is a competition for scarce resources on the moon. Only a handful of lunar sites offer near permanent sunlight, for example, for energy, and only certain locations are well positioned to support travel and resource extraction. These sites are limited in number, and the competition to secure them, especially considering mechanisms like safety zones, risks transforming scientific exploration into geopolitical entrenchment. So where does this leave us? I would suggest that cislunar security is best understood as a continuation and as a novelty, bringing in with it risks of an escalation. It carries forward certain unresolved definitional dilemmas from battles, while also introducing new pressures tied to geography, surveillance, and resource scarcity. The result is a domain where existing uncertainties are magnified and where the potential for rivalry may be heightened and has new dimensions. Yet, to conclude, I want to return to the theme of hope. Unlike many other areas of outer space, the moon's non-militarization is explicitly codified. This clarity can serve as a foundation, a starting point from which to build a genuinely peaceful framework for cislunar activities. The challenge before us is whether we will seize that opportunity. Can we learn from the paralysis of battles debates, where legal ambiguity and political deadlock often prevails, or will we allow those same dynamics to govern the future of the moon? The answer is not predetermined, it is a choice. And the moon may become yet another theater of geopolitical competition, but it may also become something different, a model for restraint, cooperation, and peace in outer space. Thank you, and I very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. I think the point about the technical challenges of monitoring activities on the moon is a really good one that often isn't brought up. A lot of space situational awareness technology and capabilities were built and are used to monitor what's happening in Earth orbit. There is a limited amount of capability of monitoring cislunar activities and traffic, and that's starting to change a little bit. But I think it just brings in that concept that technology can be a very important part of verifying any kind of agreements or understandings of what norms of behavior are. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind when we're looking at these things and thinking about future discussions for cislunar security. So thank you. With that, I have some questions for my panel. I'm just going to ask them, whoever wants to jump in can. And as well, we'll be, after we get in a few minutes, we'll be opening this up for questions from the audience too. So looking at, we've hit on this a little bit so far, but just really want to hone in on this. As aspirations shift from near Earth space to the moon, cislunar space and beyond, what sort of specific security risks do you see emerging in this new domain? And again, are these new or are these challenges that we've seen closer to Earth? I'd like to start off with that one.
Good question, right? And it was already said before that legally speaking, the moon and orbit have a bit of a different legal regime. And so I wouldn't say they are the same challenges, although in human history, we would repeat some sort of the same approach. So for me, the main security risk, as I hinted before, is around the protection of infrastructure. I don't really believe that astronauts will need military protection on the moon. I don't think there is any point into that. It's far too expensive to send humans to go to the moon in the first place. They're not going to stay for a long time, and no one will threaten them in terms of other nations. If anything, it's going to be the lunar environment itself to be the main threat for people on the moon. But when you think about the deployment of infrastructure, then it's a different story, especially if you have, for example, nuclear infrastructure that becomes dangerous in itself and could become a threat even involuntarily, or when you think about precious locations on the moon, that was already mentioned. When you start establishing an extraction plant on the moon to get resources, that is a 50 years type of investment in terms of long-term approaches, right? When you have a mining site on Earth, normally the life cycle of a mining plant is over a century. To recover even the initial investment on the moon, that might be taking even longer. And so you may want to protect that site to avoid that others may come and damage it. Again, it could be intentional or it could be unintentional. I don't see really the potential for like an active threat on the moon in the sense of like someone creating physical damage through bombs or missiles. I think those type of threats are not really relevant on the moon because it's already complicated to get there with small mass because it's just difficult. If you're going to bring a missile, again, it doesn't return on investment, even if you think about it. But it's easier to sabotage, right? It doesn't. You don't need a huge bomb to make damage on the moon. You just need a grain of dust, in fact, and that's even something that we need to understand how to avoid, even again unintentionally. So for me, like, it's going to be how are we going to ensure the safety of infrastructure, and that can transbound into the security of it if we think that there's going to be someone that has opposite intentions to us and wants to make us fail. In that sense, I think the best protection to this kind of security issues is really international cooperation. If we entangle our interest, if we develop shared infrastructure, interoperable infrastructure, then the risk of someone going against it is going to be much lower. Right. And so what my colleague was saying before about the cooperation between US and China is something that, again, we have the opportunity to develop today because going to the moon is expensive, it's difficult, and it's going to need a lot of resources. And so if you think about dividing and conquering in a way, whereas as we do on the International Space Station, where no single country provides one capability, right? They are divided. And so the propulsion is being provided by the Russians until just a few weeks ago when Dragon started to test whether they can do the same. Energy is provided differently. The capabilities of the International Space Station are distributed. So each partner needs the others. And so there is an interest from each of them not to actively pose a threat. And so if we develop the same type of infrastructure on the moon, we're going to avoid these problems. If we're going to go each with our piece of the same type of infrastructure for communication, for nuclear energy, for resource extraction, then we might incur in the risk of thinking about maybe the other party will want to make me fail intentionally so that they can take more advantage. And that kind of reasoning can easily escalate and create a lot of security issues.
Thank you. I think I definitely agree that that'd be a good idea, but I'm just curious, the political environment between the US and China is just so toxic right now, particularly coming again from DC, where the national security establishment is very, I would say, suspicious and, frankly, portraying China as the pacing threat. How do we get those countries to work together on that? How does this happen?
There's two things, right? I would say, if I can be honest with you, that it's more the environment in the US that it's toxic. I haven't heard any type of similar narrative from China. Actually, if you read, the papers that are released by the government, at least those public ones, they never mention once the US as a threat. They never mention once the US as a political rival. This narrative only exists in the United States, at least in the public domain. And maybe in the private circles, these things are discussed. But the way we talk, it makes the others react to what we think. And so I would say the US can adjust this problem by adjusting its narrative. And in that sense, political power is hopefully temporary. So in 3 years, there may be a new administration that will have a different approach. And we were just looking at the longer term of lunar activity. So yes, there is a lot of damage that can be done in just a short term. At the same time, that can be contained through other interests. So commercial interest, for example, is in nobody's interest if you're a business that want to go to the moon to have this kind of geopolitical tension, because it will make your investment in the moon more at risk. So my hope is that the very powerful US commercial industry can lobby the government into reducing the tension by adjusting its narrative so that they can better protect their interests. Then whether that will lead into actual cooperation with China, it's another story, maybe not in the next 3 years, but it can avoid that we do something that we might regret very deeply in the next few ones.
Great. And not to make this a US-China discussion, but from the other panelists, what do you see as emerging, specific security risks emerging in this new domain?
When considering space law as well, regarding the scarcity also of certain interesting infrastructural points, the principle of common heritage is quite deeply enshrined with regards to the cislunar regime as well. And adding to the perspective on how states could cooperate in this regime, considering the amount of locations that are truly beneficial for either deep space exploration or lunar extraction are quite scarce. Meaning, if we think about this common heritage pointer for the benefit of all mankind, a governance model that either indeed supports a shared model of these infrastructural points, introduces shared infrastructure, I think would be a very good future for the moon, but also deeply enshrined in actual space law.
Thank you. So I think first of all, start from very beginning. I think we talk about the new environment. I would say the risks that arise in the cislunar space is not entirely new. I think actually if we look into the issues that have already happened in the outer space in general areas, I think it can also happen in the cislunar space. But if we look into the special environment or unique environment in the cislunar space, we have to consider how to apply the existing legal regime to the cislunar space environment. I think that is a major point. I think we have to look into. Then I think we also mentioned about the China and US issue. Well, I think as we have already known, I think China always holds a open attitude. I think for international cooperation. In a way, I must say, I think in the cislunar areas, I think we would not use cooperation or competition. I think probably it's kind of a competition issue. So that means I think on the one hand, there should be some areas of cooperation, but on the other hand, we do have some competition. I think so we combine both. We have the common ground. If we look into the cislunar space areas and also outer space, the existing near Earth orbit, we already think about military advantages, etc. But if we look into the cislunar space, probably now most countries, if not all, are looking to the commercial aspect and also use the cislunar space or orbit as a platform for deep space exploration. So in this sense, we're looking to the commercial aspect. That could be a lot of common areas for the two countries to work on. So that's one issue. Now, the new issues coming up, I think actually there are quite a lot of the new issues we can consider. I think we have just mentioned about the common heritage of mankind, but there are also other issues. For example, we look into the environmental protection. We look into the dispute resolution. I think all these are new issues that are coming up. Dispute resolution is a hot topic. In the general space field, we do have some discussions already, but how to apply these the dispute resolution mechanism to cislunar space areas, I think that could be something that we need to look into. Of course, I can expand a little bit more, but I think for the time being, I'll stop here and I can elaborate later on. Thank you.
So related as well to what Lisa was saying, I think that the scarcity of resources will also lead to this situation where they place certain infrastructure and establish a safety zone to prevent others from entering that area. And I can see how that can create like a certain escalation. And if we think about it, safety zones are not a new thing. Like you already have it in UNCLOS, in maritime law, but you have more specific and more guidance in UNCLOS about how they are supposed to operate. So I think that if we manage to come, even with a soft law instrument or norms of behavior pertaining to what is reasonable in terms of safety zones and whether if it's located near to resources or in an area where it's very special due to the access to solar energy, then I think that can like also contribute to avoid certain tensions and to establish like more clear rules. But it's not a new problem that we have. It's something that we need to work into.
The zones, because that could be one of the most misunderstood or misunderstandable concept in international space law, right? And again, there is certain narratives around it, but when you read what's written about it, so the US government released through NASA a lunar landing policy analysis that was authored by Gabriel Sweeney, who is one of the fathers of the Artemis Accords, right? If you read that document, it tells you word by word what a safety zone is not. Maybe it cannot tell you what it is, but it tells you what is not, and it's not a keep out zone. It's written black and white by the very same country that came up with the concept. So we can keep talking about safety zone as something that could, endanger the stability of international space law, and then maybe we will be self-fulfilling this prophecy. Or we can look at it as what it is, which is a tool to manage risk and potential interference. And that's where I think we can propose something else. So a safety zone, to me, the way I look at it, it's a liability tool. It's an area that I declare I have a certain piece of infrastructure, I am doing a certain operation, it's dangerous, it could create risk to me and you. If you come and you don't tell me, and there is something that happens, if there is an accident, that's on you. It's like, for me, I see it as a dispute resolution mechanism in the future. No? It's like, I warned you, you didn't care, you came in, damage happened, now you're going to pay for it, you're going to be responsible for it. This is how I see a safety zone. So it creates certain obligation, but it certainly cannot prevent you from doing anything because nobody has that power under international law.
Thank you. I think I also follow up on the issue of a safety zone. I think when the safety zone was put in the UNMISS Accord, I think a lot of concerns were raised regarding the non-appropriation principle. But now I think if we look into the discussions, the UN Corpus Working Group, the latest draft has made it very clear, use the temporary. I think it's a very good way to reconcile. On the one hand, I think non-appropriation principle. On the other hand, I think that's also avoidance of harmful interference. I think how to better strike a balance between two. I think we have already noted it's not forbidden or preventing all countries from entering. We have the visitation rights. We of course have a prior notification. I think all these arrangements basically try to strike a balance. On the one hand, we do not monopolize the areas, but on the other hand, other countries can still can come in. I think to avoid interference in the normal activities of or normal operations of the station. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we wanted this to evolve into looking at safety zones entirely, but I think it does speak to how complicated these issues and why it's important to have conversations cross-cutting between Geneva and Vienna, because a lot of the issues discussed in one fora absolutely affects discussions, and I think shapes the geopolitical environment that the other fora is discussing. And just to identify as well, I mean, as a backup to discuss these sort of things, the reason why some of these different topics have emerged is that the moon is literally a different place. And that sounds like maybe that's a fairly obvious thing to say, but things are different there. Gravity acts differently there. Dust acts differently there. Plumes travel farther there. The orbits are not stable around the moon, much like they are for Earth. And so while I think, you can see, okay, some of these challenges are, you can cover with legal regime that already exists, you do need to say, well, how do they interpret it and how do they apply given this slightly different physical environment? So I think just bringing that's part of the reason why some of these topics have emerged. Another question I wanted to hear from the panel, and soon we'll be opening up from the audience because I see placards are starting to go up. I want to have time for people to ask their questions. But looking at, the rise of cislunar traffic and the development of new technologies for lunar missions, we're just going to see that continue to increase as more actors seek to engage in activities in cislunar space and beyond. So looking at that, what kind of transparency and confidence building measures and what sort of coordination can we see to prevent miscalculation, mistrust, inadvertent escalation between the various actors? Thoughts from our panel?
I think this goes back to what I said in my opening remarks about space situational awareness, is that there are so many issues regarding the cislunar region in general that states simply do not have the current tools to correctly understand or see what other states or commercial actors are doing. A few years ago, we simply relied on amateur awareness to see what was going on the moon. And I think this is where transparency and confidence building measures, also what we discussed in length yesterday, play a really big role to kind of fill in that gap. Because without the tools of even being able to properly see, we cannot understand either. So that's where I think that TCBMs are even more important maybe than in the regular Earth orbit.
Completely agree with that. And I remember a few years ago, I was discussing this very topic about cislunar situational awareness with Charity Whedon when she was still at Astroscale, so even before NASA. And we identified that as a potential area for commercial applications. Because again, if you do have a government system for cislunar awareness, then you might interpret that as surveillance. You could feel a bit intimidated by it if you're another country. And just a few days ago, Digantar and iSpace announced a partnership to develop a cislunar situational awareness system, which would be an infrastructure that, being commercial, could be used potentially by any partner, right? In that sense, I think the use of commercial actors can help de-escalate those kind of tension. That said, information sharing for me is the start of everything. We need to do better at information sharing. That is a topic that I think in the past 5 years has started to get more on the rise of the multilateral discussions. And from our side, if I also can do a little bit of advertisement, Victoria, we just spent the last 9 months discussing information sharing, and we produced something called Lunar Information Sharing 1-on-1, which is the result of like 45 stakeholders of views, mostly from governments, on how do we share information for lunar activities? What do we share? Why do we share it? And how? And when? Also, the timing of the information sharing is critical. And I have to say, like, recent practice under Article 11 of the Aerospace Treaty is making me more hopeful for the future. You might have seen that the first notification of under Article 11 of the Aerospace Treaty was in 1967. It was probably the first actually put into use of the Aerospace Treaty was Article 11, which is, by the way, a provision that talks about that states agree to share information on the nature, conduct, location, and results of their space activities. In 1967, the United States submitted the first notification under Article 11 to report about the Surveyor mission that crashed on the moon. Fast forward to 2025, we have about 5 more countries submitting notifications under Article 11, Luxembourg and Japan being the last ones. The first time they ever used Article 11 was to submit about the iSpace mission that was supposed to go to the moon. And it's interesting because it was licensed by 2 countries. There was the lander that was licensed by Japan, and then there was a space resources mission that was licensed by both Japan and Luxembourg. And each of these countries submitted a notification to talk about the mission. Interestingly enough, the question is, can we start doing that maybe in advance? instead of afterwards. So that it allows us to do coordination in case there is any potential issue or any potential overlap. I think if we start implementing that practice, that's going to become more and more relevant. So that's one of the things that we start with, and then you can build upon it at the multilateral level, for example, through ATLAC and the consultation process they're looking to develop.
Yeah, I completely agree with Antonio says. And when you were posing the question, I first thought operationalizing what we already have in the Aerospace Treaty. So Article 11, as Antonio was mentioning, the iSpace mission, the US also notified for 2 missions that we're going to land on the moon this year. And we can use like Article 11 and Article 9 together. So I agree that the information should be provided before maybe, so it would allow for consultations. And we have these two tools there in the Aerospace Treaty that are barely used by states, but they are there. And then we complain when we have problems or we don't find solutions, but you have the tools, you just don't want to use them. So I think that it should be as well a case where there should be more willingness from states or more initiative to use what is already in the Aerospace Treaty.
Yes, I fully agree. I think the space information sharing, I think, is very important. This should be the starting point. If we look into the information sharing, probably this can include various issues. For example, the pre-launch notification, space object registration, etc. I think all this information should be in place. I think so will be improve the transparency issues. I think after this starting point, we also look into possible governance structure or framework to deal with the regulation of cislunar activities, space activities. For example, we can consider whether there's possibility to set up a centralized lunar coordination body, so the countries will be able to coordinate to solicit information, sharing information, and also come to negotiate on possible legal rules, regulations regarding the cislunar activities. Furthermore, we should also emphasize about the importance of international cooperation among the member states. This could help the international society to come up with synergies in the cislunar space explorations. Thank you.
One last question for me, and then definitely open up to the audience. Just big picture. How can we leverage these multilateral discussions on space security, including the ones that are ongoing on Paros, to better understand the specific challenges of cislunar space? How do we do this? Who can fix this? Thoughts?
I think so. We just shared our thoughts on CCBMs and information sharing, which is also a main point of the kind of the normative framework being built under battle. So I think that's that. I think one big lesson from the battles discussion that, of course, kind of spearheaded in 2 different governance models is a lesson to be learned, especially what we said about the moon and the importance of cooperation and the common heritage of mankind principle, is that the moon is an opportunity and to ensure that we're not going into different directions again. We don't have the same amount of time. The moon is a lot more scarce maybe than the orbital region. That I think a key lesson from battles is to build on those common heritage principles, ideas, and to stay on one track together. Maybe just build on the Outer Space Treaty to ensure that the future of the moon is one of cooperation rather than one of competition.
Yes, I think Paros, actually, it's a very good platform, to discuss relevant issues. But in the new era, I think probably we can also expand to the discussions for the cislunar activities. So that means I think we could have the multilateral platform to deal with the issue. And this also encourages the international cooperations in various issues regarding the space situational awareness, regarding the traffic management, etc. And also I think we can also expand a little bit more regarding the discussion on rules, regulations, principles of responsible behavior. So I think that will be something that we can look into. But in general, we can find out that the development of the rules and the regime for cislunar space activities should take some time. In a short or medium term, we can look into the soft legal regulations. But in long term, probably, as I said, I think the cislunar centric legal regime will be ideal. I'm not going to say that this kind of legal regime will replace the outer space treaty or any existing space law legal regime. I mean, I think probably we can consider some kind of protocols like cislunar protocol or cislunar security protocol attached to the outer space treaty, or in that kind of manner. Be helpful. Thank you.
Your question, right, about how do we leverage cross dialogue. I think we need more events like this, to be honest. And so kudos to Unidir for including cislunar into this conference. UNUSA's just started a program called One Moon for All to discuss, to have informal dialogues, high-level dialogues. I think under that framework, it would be interesting to see a partnership, maybe to look at a specific cislunar safety and sustainability event where we come together and discuss this. I find it to be highly productive. There is also already dialogue in New York between the different committees of the General Assembly that deal with these issues, but that is sometimes a bit difficult to actually move forward on concrete topics. It's very formal. This kind of a high-level informal events help a lot. So I would like to see more of those in the future, and I think they will be beneficial for all of us.
Adding on top of what Antonino said, I also think that it's very important to ensure inclusion, not only in the sense of including states from the global south, but also including young people, people from the commercial sector, people from academia, people from the government, people from the technical area. That will give you like different perspectives and new input. And I agree, more events like this are very beneficial to advance the discourse in these particular issues, but we need to ensure that there's more participation from people from other parts of the world, other areas, and not just a bunch of lawyers or policy-making people who keep talking and talking.
Lawyers talk a lot. That is crazy news to me. Thank you. Okay, so with that, we have a few minutes left for discussion. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna take a couple questions at a time. So please have your placards up if you'd like to ask a question of this fantastic panel. I'm gonna take questions from China and Switzerland now. Thank you.
Very interesting discussion. I'm not familiar with this topic as cislunar space, and I think quite useful for me to learn more new things. And since I heard the panelists mention the China-US cooperation, and also they mentioned how China is open and in this area, I would say China is not open in terms of policy, but we don't have any legislation like a wall of amendments prohibiting Chinese government or agencies to have direct bilateral cooperation with our counterpart. But my comment and question is not about this. Talking about the ongoing space security discussions, especially the newly established OEWG on perils in all its aspects. I think the scope of space security is kind of like expanding. We have more topics come into our discussion, like even cislunar space. So my question is how make our ongoing space security discussion more focused and to touch in something really, I would say, the core issue or hard security issue. For example, the weaponization, arms race, and also something happening in real, the announcement of the Golden Dome program. So how this panel could contribute to the ongoing space security discussions. So my question goes to Mr. Summary and Professor Zhao. Thank you.
Good morning, Celine Yousafzai from the Department of Defense. I thank you so much for the excellent panel this morning. And I had a question to Professor Yon. You've mentioned that it would be desired for the lunar activities to have a lunar regime, and probably starting from a normative approach first, and perhaps to get to a comprehensive lunar regime at the second stage. You mentioned at some point that China understands the lunar activities to be dual natured, and in its white paper, if I understood correctly. And you also mentioned at the later stage that the lunar activities would be considered demilitarized or should be considered demilitarized. So my question was more, how would those two terms and notions interplay? And what would be the consequence of understanding one of those notions on the other one? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we could start off with Zhao, since you had that question asked of you, and then maybe the broader panel can look at the question that China posed. Thank you.
Now, I think when I come to the first question, I think regarding the focus, I must say, I think that the discussion, I think the events, I think like this will be very helpful. I think we can frame the questions, the discussions on negotiation in a way which can be very focused. But in any sense, I think I believe that it's rather useful that to see the discussion on negotiation will be comprehensive and inclusive. The methods or the approach that have been adopted regarding the so-called hard law or soft law negotiations. So we, on the one hand, we look into PPWT. On the other hand, we look into the responsible behavior. So we have the working group, I think separate working group to negotiate, to discuss. This will be a very good way to look into the issues. So I think that will be my answer to the first question. I think more events, more focused discussions, the ways of arrangement. The second questions, I think very interesting and a very helpful question. I think when I really seriously consider about the cislunar centric legal regime. Indeed, I think I first mentioned that it's rather useful to look into how to come up with a legal regime which can help to create a sustainable and peaceful regime for the cislunar space. We talk about Article 4. We use Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty as a foundational basis, and to look into how we can modify or how we can revise the legal regime. I mentioned about, yes, paragraph 1, probably we can use a demilitarization. That will be ideal situation. Of course, I think we also note that mention about the difficulties regarding the understanding of demilitarization or the use of the term of a dual-use nature. I think the discussions about the dual-use nature has been in place for many years. And in a way, I would say that we can think about the pragmatic approach regarding discussion about weapon or other issues. The definition will be helpful, but on the other hand, we should not be prevented from further discussion about the issue simply because of the definition or understanding of the dual use. If we look at the ways of dealing with the dual use, I think like the discussions yesterday, I believe that it's good that we put down the term weapon or dual use, but we can also have a lower level of legislation or specific rules defining what kind of products or goods or services can be considered a dual use. So that will be one way to think about the methods or the approach to come up with a mechanism or regime to deal with cislunar space legal regime. So I think that's a point. I think when I look into the peaceful issue. But also, again, I think if I look into the responsible or sustainability issue, I think, again, I think this will be easier to deal with. I think probably the question, I think, mainly focus on the first part, I think, regarding the peacefulness, understanding of peacefulness, I think that part. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you to the distinguished delegates from China and from the Swiss delegation for their questions. Since the one from China was directed also to me, maybe I'll share a few thoughts on how do we make more focused discussion. For me, there are 3 steps to do that. Number one, we need to identify what do we want to talk about? What are our priorities? Obviously, resources today are limited. Our time is limited. There are many issues that have to be discussed. It's not easy to put together people to move forward with this kind of discussion. So we need to agree what are the top 3 priorities that we need to address. And I think last year at the sustainability conference that was organized by UNUSA, there was an attempt to begin that. And I think it was a very positive one. It was even acknowledged in the Corpus reports. Panelists from both CNSA and NASA were agreeing on what are the priorities that they need to address. Maybe the same in the security discussions would help us to understand what are the top 3 security issues that we see for the moon. Do we share these priorities? Do we need to find common ground on those? So that's number one. Number two, and I find it to be extremely important, especially in the security domain, is to clarify misunderstandings and misassumptions. What do we think about what the others think? Sometimes, like I mentioned before, with safety zone, we tend to make assumptions that need to be clarified. And the only way to do that is if we have frank and candid conversations. So sometimes track to diplomacy, which I know Secure World is also promoting a lot between US and China, is something that can help a lot to say, okay, we have these priorities. What are the main fears we have about these priorities? And do we share these fears? Maybe we're just misinterpreting what the other party wants. That's number two. And then number three, we need open channels for ongoing discussions. These things will not get solved in a day or in a panel or in a conference. They will continue to change as we learn more about the lunar environment. So there's going to be a need for an open platform that we can come back to and say, we have this problem to solve now. For example, when some of the last missions launched to the moon were not notified, CARI, the Korean Aerospace Research Institute, they had themselves the problem of, are they going to interfere or not with the KPLO, the Korean Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter? And the lack of any notification about these missions made it very difficult for them. They had to perform an emergency maneuver on the moon. There is like only a handful of objects orbiting the lunar orbit, orbiting the lunar surface, and we're already having emergency maneuvers. So in that sense, we need to do better at open dialogues. I think I commended before China because they did not escalate tensions in terms of narrative. I recognize, though, that there is a need for more open channels when US and Chinese actors can talk. For example, in the SSA environment, there is an email address that I am aware of whereby there is a notification sent from counterparts that would like to discuss with China on how do we avoid a collision. And that email address is maybe monitored, maybe not. There is not always a response from it. So maybe doing a little bit better than that on both ends of the spectrum will help us to know, okay, if there is a problem, we know where to go and how to talk. Because if we don't have that, then we start acting rashly, and that's where the problems can begin, I think.
Okay, we're getting near end of time, so I think I see 3 placards raised. I'm going to ask, okay, crap. All right. You guys are working with me here. All right. Quickly, we will do these questions, and I'm going to ask my panelists to be succinct. Because I like to have a time for closing things. So here for you, there, Andre. Ask your questions quickly, succinctly. You guys respond quickly, succinctly. I will be quick and succinct. Thank you.
Thank you, panel, for the valuable insights. I'm Liliana, and I'm a research co-lead at the Space Generation Advisory Council, and I'm also a space law scholar at New York University, but all views are my own today. In COPUS this year, we saw that principles like due regard continue to generate uncertainty. In particular, several states noted that there were no equivalent international law or language, and there were also other questions about how due regard differs from concepts like responsible behavior. So, as you have discussed in your speech, we have learned from the Outer Space Treaty that such ambiguities can lead to diverse interpretations across legal systems. As states now look towards activities and draft new laws in the cislunar environment, what concrete actions can we take to avoid this problem again? And would it be clearer to do drafting practices in another way, or have a glossary of key terms or other interpretive mechanisms to promote a common understanding? And this question is directed towards Dr. Victoloni. Thank you.
For the floor, Guyu from BIT. So the most important thing here for the government or the military is to recognize, in lex lata, what are the limitations or the prohibition regarding military activities or engagement involvement on the moon. So my question, the first one, according to the interpretation of exclusively for peaceful purpose, we see so many disagrees there. But from your point of view, does it mean all kinds of military space activities are prohibited except those for peaceful purpose? Or only the 3 categories expressly listed on the second paragraph of the Article 4 are prohibited? And the subsequent question actually is discussed in the Hague Working Group, in Gadget's Law, in many working groups outside UN, whether space resources must be exclusively used for peaceful purpose. We have different views, but I have to say, sorry about that. During the discussion under the Hague Working Group, I have the view, I disagree with this expression because it's beyond the scope of lex lata. And I have the support from our colleague from State Department of the United States. So we already work together in different fora, at least for the rules-making interpretation of treaty. And I believe that these two countries must and will cooperate. Before the cooperation regarding specific space program or mechanism, we already work together very well about rules making. Thank you.
Myself, Naman, and I'm the CEO of Orbitak. It was a great panel discussion, first of all. So as there was mention of outer space treaty, which specifically mentions that no country can claim the moon or any other celestial bodies. But now we see that more countries, private companies, and even individual technologists are creating mining plans and autonomous satellites. So how do we figure out who should have the authority to set the rules and who to hold accountable? And the key to space governance, shouldn't it be shared globally rather than just controlled by a few powerful players or space agencies? And last but not the least, how can we make sure that such bilateral agreements contribute to global security and transparency rather than creating exclusive advantages only for a few powerful individuals?
Would the panelists elaborate further on information sharing? Because given that much information about states' space activities is inherently linked to military and intelligence operations with various levels of security classifications, I feel information sharing is one thing, but could you also shed some light on how the information is actually managed in practice?
Thank you. And I'm going to throw in one more question from online, not so much that I think we might be able to get to all of them, but I think it really indicates the complexity of the topic that we're looking at in terms of the dual purpose, the dual use nature of a lot of the technologies on the moon. What kind of safeguards could be put in place to ensure that they're not inadvertent escalatory? And with that, we have 5 questions, 5 minutes, 4 panelists. So we may not get to fully get in deep on these discussions, but I think we've all agreed this probably is going to be the first, but hopefully not the last time we'll be discussing this. The stuff to dig into the future. So with that, guys, panelists, I'd like you to very quickly, less than a minute each, give you some responses. And then also maybe if you had one takeaway you want people to take from your remarks today, what would that be?
I will focus on the first question since it was directed towards me. I just want to clarify, I'm not a doctor yet, but hopefully soon. So concrete actions that we can take, for example, negotiations in different languages. The Aerospace Treaty was only negotiated in English. So now we see UNCLOS, for example, was negotiated in all the official UN languages. So that can be something to use. The lexicon elaborated as well can be a tool that can be very useful to avoid these different concepts and interpretations. And then my takeaway in all of these peaceful purposes or military activities, I personally consider that peaceful purposes means non-aggressive, just because from the beginning of space activities, we have seen many military uses of outer space, including GPS, I think is the most obvious example. So I will identify when we talk about non-peaceful uses as non-aggressive uses. Sorry. Thank you.
The private entities, I think, can claim for ownership, etc. Indeed, I think the very beginning, when in 2015, when the United States made the new law, the ISL, International Institute of Space Law, has put forward the views that, of course, I think this is not illegal in a way, I think, in compliance with the existing space legal regime. But we have to consider whether this will be the ideal approach or ideal way to move forward. Then, of course, I think we look into, I think, further developments. We have the bilateral approach, I think the Artemis Accord. Then I think this probably, I think with more countries are joining the Artemis Accord, that probably, I think that's way to move forward to look into the possibility of coming up with a customary international law. I think that will be, we will have to wait and see. But the ideal way, I think we still prefer a multilateral approach in a negotiation to come up with a regime regarding the space resources uses. So I think my takeaway is that I think probably in the space field, we still look forward to have a more multilateral approach to resolve major issues. I think multilateral platform will be very helpful. Thank you.
I'll be telegraphic since there were so many and they were already addressed by my colleagues. So on due regard, just wanted to point to the ISL symposium that we organized at the legal subcommittee. You can rewatch it on the website of UNUSA, and we are preparing a report. So hopefully you can find some more information there. Guyu, to your question, we've been discussing this together several times, so you know my opinion, but I'm going to state it loud and clear. For me, exclusively peaceful purposes means that any kind of military activity is prohibited, no matter the reason, no matter the purpose. I take the view that only the very few examples mentioned in Article 4.2 are allowed. So you could use military personnel, and that's it pretty much for me, including on space resources. I would say especially on space resources. Imagine a future where people start manufacturing weapons with space resources. We don't want to see that future. So for me, I take a more extensive interpretation, but I recognize there are different views on it. In terms of authority to set rules, that was asked as well, and global governance, that's why we have COPUS, which is the place to discuss multilateral space governance. There are many working groups and action teams currently discussing that COPUS. Let's work together to make things succeed. By 2027, Unispace could be an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism, not just through words, but through action. So I still have hope there. Yes. And final thought, symbolic gestures can also help. You asked me before, how do we make US-China cooperation happen? During the first Trump administration, we were actually very close to an exchange of samples, lunar samples between US and China. Maybe it's not going to happen in the next 3 years, but something like that could be very powerful. The whole ISS was created by gestures that started with the Apollo-Soyuz program. So maybe something like that in the future can lead us towards the right way, and more conferences and dialogues like this, because this was great fun. So thank you, Victoria, as well.
I feel like that this conference is just a really good indication that there might be more momentum to talk about cislunar security, because it is truly different than orbital security. And I think what I said in my opening remarks, but I also want to reiterate what Martina said in her opening remarks, cislunar security, just like space security, does not stand in a vacuum. There are other fields of international law that we should take inspiration from. And I believe a key advantage of the cislunar region is that there is a bit less ambiguity regarding the obligations, especially in the military field, that I think is a strength and again, hope that we should continue on forward with.
Thank you. And so just from my takeaway, just in the discussion we've had today, I think we're starting to see what is responsible behavior on cislunar space. Is it sharing information about planned activities and programs? Is it looking at sharing best practices from a technical perspective? Is it discussion of policy and principles and looking ahead at cooperative solutions for the future? So with that, please join me in thanking my panel for a fantastic discussion.